Can you bring your card to me?
Okay. Okay, well, I will ask my friend. Ah, yes.
Higgins cherche ses livres.
Bio, if I could. Well, what happened instead was that in 1958, Cage gave a spectacular concert known as the Town Hall Concert, which was a retrospective of his work of 25 years. It blew my mind. After that, no question, not only was I going to change my orientation, but I also wanted to study with Cage. So that's how I came to his new school course.
And
Already interested in Gertrude Stein, and they did Dr. Faustus Lights the Lights, which had music by Jackson McLough. And however, I did not remember the name of the composer. I only remembered that it was very interesting sounds. And so it was quite wonderful when later in 1958, in the summer, Cage went to Europe. And in his absence, Jackson McLough came to the class, and I got to meet Jackson and talk with him and see what he was doing. And for example, I had no idea that Jackson was doing chance operations with poetry, because I had already started to do some experiments with chance operations and poetry myself. And so I don't even know the date exactly of when I first did chance poetry, probably in 1957, just a year before. And I think he did it even earlier. But anyway, it was a year or so after he started, I started doing chance with poetry. And since then, my career as a poet has paralleled Jackson's in many, many details. Sometimes he would do something and I would do it independently. Sometimes he would do something and it would provoke me to do things. Perhaps the same is true vice versa. I really don't know. But Jackson is the poet with whom I have felt closest over the years. And I took it in 58 and then again in 59, whenever I could.
You said
Cage was the first artist that I know of who used systems to get beyond his personal taste and personal experience. Before that, there was always lurking in the background the idea that art should express the artist. Cage created a different model. He created instead the model where you don't so much compose a piece out of yourself as you develop it from a response to the environment, which is in fact what chance does. No way does chance take you completely beyond yourself, because after all you make the system. But it means that you're no longer responsible for the details. I never subscribed to the ideology, the mystique of chance. For me, it was a technical matter. In this, I've always differed somewhat from Cage and greatly from a lot of the people who have worked with him. Because chance to me was just a way of filling in the formal conceptions which one had and of going beyond what we could have guessed needed to be done. Perceiving something in nature, you discover what you are looking at, and if it turns out that it is closer to poetry than it was to what you thought of as music before, why then you realize that the piece wants to be something which I did not want to stop it becoming. And so therefore I had to follow where the work would lead. That is why I transferred my allegiance from being a composer of music as such to being a composer using words. Another thing that's very important to realize is that we in the United States did not have as much of a knowledge of sound poetry as you had in Europe. There was no indigenous tradition of sound poetry here to which we could refer. There were, of course, certain things in traditional Native American materials, for example, American Indian things, which Jerome Rothenberg later brought to us. But I did not know of that at the time. I only learned about it when I read in transition to the articles by Eugene Jolas, which refer to this material, but that's all that I knew about it. And so the development of sound poetry has never been as profound here as it has in Europe. In America, sound poetry has tended to be closer to performance poetry. I'm thinking of John Giorno and people like that. And also, in America, many of the people who did Cage's indeterminate or chance-related poetry in Europe probably would have been doing pure sound poetry, because we had Cage here, and in Europe they were closer to the sound poetry tradition. That's why sound poetry did not really develop in the United States until somewhat after it did in Europe, while chance poetry never developed in Europe to the same extent that it did here. Cage was a very powerful influence on us, not in the direct sense, but in that he opened so many doors that it seemed crazy not to go through quite a few of them. One could not fight against Cage. That would be stupid. On the other hand, one didn't either want to duplicate what he had already done, so that what one would do instead would be to take what he had done as a sort of paradigm and parallel it through one's own findings and experience. That's why, for example, in Cage's way of looking at things, repetition was not appropriate. For me, it was no problem at all to have repetition. Cage's concept of nature, with its indeterminacy and so on, is more appropriate to biology. But I had studied geology, and I knew that in the formation of crystal structures that there are lattices. These lattices are the results of repetition, because certain chemical elements only have certain valences. And therefore, when they form crystals, the crystals are always similar to each other. There is repetition in nature. And so it seemed to me that repetition, for example, was not something to be purged from one's work or the result of thinking about things wrong. It was just another of the possibilities. That's why in my early performance pieces, such as Stacked Deck, there's a great deal of repetition. Nothing is ever quite the same as it was before. Partly it's modified by the context in which it takes place. But repetition as such never bothered me. That's probably the biggest ground in which my work differs from Cage and from the other people who were working with Cage at the time. I won't call them the school of Cage, because there's really no such thing. But I would say that that was the biggest difference between myself and my colleagues that were also working with Cage. Work very well in the context of the happenings. Why? Because Capro's circle were all artists, visual artists, and they were very concretely organized towards the production of visual art, naturally enough. I came out of music, others came out of literature, and others came out of kinds of visual art which were really quite different from what Capro and his group did. They were oriented also towards making environments. I had at that time no interest in making environments per se. In fact, quite the opposite. I was interested in a concept of portability. I wanted to do a piece in one context and then do it in a different context, and see how the context would change the piece and how it would affect it. And so many of my early pieces, such as the contributions and the constellations, change according to where they are performed. And so I was not the only one who was uncomfortable working in a format in which we were so oriented towards museums and galleries at that time. And so we were very pleased when Lamont Young, who also had something of the same problem, found a man named George Machunas, who at that time had a gallery on Madison Avenue. And George wanted to have an ongoing festival of performance pieces. Remember, they still had no name. We call this prefluxus, this kind of thing. And so performances did take place there, and they also took place at Yoko Ono's loft downtown, and they took place at the Epitome Coffee Shop. I like the Epitome Coffee Shop concept because it reminds me of the Café Voltaire. It was an open place where we could meet a large public as opposed to a usual art-oriented public, and that was very important for us at that time. Later it would be a different matter. So we still had no name until George Maciunas decided to take the material which was left over after an anthology was put together and make a periodical of it, which was to be called Fluxus. That was the name of a publishing operation. And so I went to Europe, where he was going to give a series of concerts to publicize his periodical. And it was the press, the newspapers, that had no other way to describe us than to call us the Fluxus people, since we were part of the group that did the magazine. It's very much like what happened much later in language poetry, where there was a magazine called Language. The poets associated with language eventually became called the Language Poets. But it took its name from its periodical, and we took the name Fluxus from George's magazine. But the big difference between Fluxus and the other iconoclastic art movements or tendencies in this century, such as Futurism, Dada, Surrealism, etc., is that Fluxus was not there at the very, very beginning. That's why there was always a greater degree of difference among the Fluxus people than there was among the Dadaists or Surrealists. We had no pope. Maciunas never had the authority within our group that Breton had within Surrealism. This is very important, and that's why there is no Fluxus manifesto. But
No.
Somewhere about this, about 62 or 3, I became aware of Gomringer's work, maybe even earlier. But the term constellation is actually an old musical term for a group of notes that come together but not precisely. And I was referring to the musical term. It is a kind of broken chord. And Henry Cowell used the term habitually, and Cage occasionally used it also. So it's not necessary to go to Gomringer for that. On the other hand, the other term that I used at the same time, concretion, the making concrete of things, that I was aware of Max Bill. Wittenborn had turned me on to Max Bill, although he was not and still is not well known in the United States. I did not know the connection between Max Bill and Gomringer, of course, not yet. But I knew that he had made concretions, and I wanted to make concretions of my own. And I was thinking also of the term musique concrète. In what sense is musique concrète concrete? The answer is that it's concrete because it's concrete with your experience. And that also was part of the idea that I used in the concretions. And one of my Mimeo booklets is called Constellations and Contributions. And those contributions are a form of concretion. 3 cons. Early in 1959, or perhaps the end of 58. And the series continues today. These are open-ended performance notations. They suggest performances, and in very few cases do I define how the performance is to take place. They are notations for the sake of notations, rather than notations at the service of performance. If you let the notation decide what it wants to be, you can then find another way of realizing it as a performance than if you try to achieve the performer's intention. It was another way that I had of refusing to express my own intention, but instead allowing it to be used, assuming goodwill. Immanuel Kant, in describing the categorical imperative, makes his assumption that people will proceed with goodwill. I always found this extremely important. Cage did the same with his concert for piano and orchestra, and sometimes the musicians did not have goodwill. If you assume goodwill, and you also then assume that people can realize the piece in some way, you will have a performance which will get beyond your taste and which will somehow be concrete with social experience. Eric Anderson did the same thing in his own way when he did that piece of his which has an alphabet set in, I think, Mistral typeface, And that's all he gave to a whole orchestra of musicians with the instruction, I have confidence in you. It had the same impulse as the graphic notations that we did, to try to get things that would be a little more open-ended than the things which you could fully notate. Schoenberg had taken fully notated music as far as I think it could be, and Stockhausen and so on, the post-Webern composers after him, of course. But they're basically taking off from the Schoenberg method. And I didn't think that there was any reason to do that because they were doing it so well. And the impulse for me to innovate usually consists of discovering what's already been done and doing something else.
Yes, it's
60 pieces are notationless pieces with words instead. And I did some in 57 already in my 27 pieces for the Aquarian Theatre. Because this was the age of, the coming of the age of Aquarius. It's really the age of Pisces, of course. I also liked the idea in Aquarius as an image of the return of water to its source that you find in the tarot cards, for example. And so to me, to go back to the source and work with notations that way, that were verbal, seemed perfectly natural and logical. And those, my first pieces of that sort, were already done before I studied with Cage. Those are published in many places. They're in the FOEW book. They appeared in a magazine in 1961, the Chelsea Review, and so on. And in the Cage class, indeed. But we had all done pieces before we came to the Cage class, which were in these verbal notations. George and myself and Lamont Young all reached that way of working independently of each other. Perhaps there were others who came to it also. It was an idea which was in the air. And to try to establish a priority there is almost impossible. Had difficulty with. I don't like an artifact that's too rigid, but on the other hand, if you focus on process too much, then you get into aesthetic difficulties, because you wind up with a piece which doesn't allow room for hard focus. You can only have things which are a little bit vague. There's something too arbitrary about it, and I find it rather uncomfortable. So that process art may be good for other people, but for me it's really a difficulty. I find it analogous to process education. People speak a lot of the educational process, and the difficulty with that is that then you wind up with people who know where to look something up, but they don't know anything without looking it up. That bothers me. So that I don't like artifact as such, object as such, but I do like to have some sort of flexibility to it, and I think we need both extremes in order to have an intermedium where I'm comfortable.